Hello everyone, my name is Alek Tarkowski. I am the co-director and co-founder of Open Future Foundation, a European think tank for the open movement. I am very glad to be able to speak today on Free Software Day about issues that I care deeply about, those related to broadly understood openness on the internet. I'm very sorry that I am not able to join you live today. This is a pre-recorded video, so there will be no opportunity to ask questions, unfortunately, but I'm sharing my contact details in the end, and please free to contact me if you would like to discuss these issues. I'm always interested in learning about people who share the same perspectives on openness. So what is our perspective at Open Future? Basically, we're a think tank that after several decades of the development of the open model believes that we need to ask questions about open. We need to revisit our strategies, ask what have been our successes, but also what have been our failures and challenges, and how the open model needs to adapt to an ever-changing technological environment. And this is what I would like to do in my talk. I have been asked to talk to an open source and free software community about open data. This has always been exciting for me to be able to bridge sort of the silos of different open areas, to talk with people working on data about education, with people working on education, talk about science. I'm a deep believer in something we could call a big or connected open. So this is something I will do today, but I also want to connect that with developments in European data governance, because this is our perspective at Open Future. We believe the really important work happens when we connect movement strategies with policy and advocacy work in key areas, and data governance, I believe, is one such very important area today. So you will see me address the issue of open data and data governance, but I want to put it first in a bigger context. And let me start by saying that I think also policy work is very important. I don't know whether those of you who listen pay attention to policies or not. I know a lot of people in the broadly understood open movement focus either on practical work. This is often probably in the case of open source, simply working with technology. But I think activism and a sort of political sense is very important. It is needed for us to defend open, but also needed to build open. And here I connect with an idea that's really important for me. Doing policy work is basically world building. World building is an idea often employed in science fiction, where great science fiction authors build worlds with their work. I think with policy we do the same. Policy is often seen as a pretty boring area that's best left alone to technocrats. I don't agree with that. I think through policies we basically shape reality around us, and we face a fundamental challenge whether policies that we design are meant only to strengthen the market or disrupt an industry, as is often the case, or whether we can ask for something more, for policies that build a digital society, or in other words, build the world. So also I want to share with you an anecdote, especially that this talk will be pretty late at night for some of you, at least here in Europe. So I think it's a good moment to tell some stories. And this is a story written by one of the greatest storytellers, I think, of recent times, and a master world builder, Ursula Le Guin. I'm sure a lot of you know her, and she wrote a beautiful essay about storytelling called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which I think is also relevant for thinking about how we build the digital reality. So basically, Ursula Le Guin describes how at some point people decided that great stories require action. And if you want action, you also need a hero who's powerful, who can do amazing things. And quickly you discover that the real people that we should be talking about, people leading their normal lives, are hidden by the hero. The story of the hero doesn't really tell stories about normal people. And Le Guin goes on to say, I like novels because instead of heroes, they have normal people in them. How does that connect with policy work? I hope this is not a stretch, but I think that if we look at debates about technology today and also at the shape of the digital ecosystem, a lot of people would say there is clearly a hero, and that's a platform. Or alternatively, it's some powerful emergent technology. Some would name blockchain, some would name artificial intelligence. But I think there's a different approach, a lot closer to these ideas that Le Guin is inspiring us to follow, and connected with this idea of world building, that what really counts are ecosystems. Or if we want to translate that into more technical speak, these are software development kits, APIs, and protocols also, standards. And all these tools that I think are very well known in the open source community, they are not so well understood in the policymaking community, but they're an alternative way of thinking about how we build technologies. Our goal shouldn't be to basically establish a payment processor in the middle or build some new market around the platform. That's the sort of pitch of a lot of the current startup culture thinking that asks us to think about unicorns. An alternative approach says that we really need to build ecosystems. And I believe this thinking is at the heart of a lot of thinking about open source and open data as well. So next I want to tell a story that's foundational for us at Open Future, and it's a story that we tell to explain a bit how we think open has changed over years. And we call this story the story of the paradox of open. It's a story that tries to revisit certain assumptions that we made 20 or even more years ago in the case of open source and free software, definitely more than 20 years. In the case of open content, the field where I work. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, before I started my foundation, I've been mainly connected with the Creative Commons movement. I've co-founded the Polish chapter of Creative Commons, and also I'm currently on the board of the organization. So we had certain ideas, and with this essay we tried to revisit them. So what is this paradox of open? To very briefly summarize it, together with my colleague Paul Keller, who co-founded our foundation with me and wrote this essay, we wrote it together. The challenge is that today open is not only a challenge to concentrations of power, but an enabler of them. This part of challenging concentrations of power has been the original vision of open, be it open source or open code. Or open content or open data, that we need to break these ideas that knowledge or culture can be controlled, that they are proprietary, that someone can own them. And this idea of opening up was this very strong vision connected to a sense of social freedom, but also social justice. Where are we 20 years ago? There are some very powerful cases of success. The one I really like to mention is Wikimedia. I think it's a flagship project of the open movement and basically an amazing civilizational feat and amazing social feat. But in many other cases, this balance of power is a lot more ambiguous. And I would like to note, since this is Software Freedom Day, one of the conclusions of a very recent report published by the European Commission and prepared by Fraunhofer Institute and Open Forum Europe on the impact of open source. And there's a very interesting moment there where the authors state that proprietary platforms benefit from open source in a very specific way, and one we would describe as this sort of enabler of power, a situation where openness is used by often a platform or some other commercial entity to simply gain control. And they say that platforms employ hybrid strategies to take advantage of open source software while retaining control. This is exactly the challenge. A vision of sharing is still respected at a certain level, in this case at the level of code, but overall it leads to a process often called platformization of the internet, which is about increased centralization, increased even monopolistic power, and a lot of power imbalances, and something that is very far from the ideals, for example, of the open internet. And we see this story repeating again and again in a lot of spheres. A lot of our work at Open Future is about understanding this paradox. But one more example I want to give of an attempt, I think, and a pretty successful one to solve this paradox is of the Wikimedia Enterprise API. Maybe you've heard that last year, or maybe it was early this year, Wikimedia announced that it will offer paid version of its API targeted at the largest commercial users. These have been for a long time now making very intense use of Wikipedia as a database of knowledge. And the Wikimedia Foundation and the community decided in the new Wikimedia strategy that this is simply leading to a certain imbalance. They see that certain actors profit more than others from this open resource that should be treated as a commons, and therefore the gains they have are disproportionate to what they put into the community. So the way they should contribute is by paying for API access. This is not an API that gives access to sort of standard Wikimedia content. This content is structured and clean, broadly speaking, to make it more useful. And in a way, this is a freemium model where these commercial users are asked to pay for access. It's a model that Wikimedia says makes the project more sustainable and also provides a more clear relationship between Wikimedia and enterprise users. And it's also important to note that the foundation notes the need to democratize data, and it provides different access rules, for example, for academic research or non-profit organizations. So I think this is, in the end, a story about open data approached in a really new way. Typically, the open data advocate would say that they want data released through an API, a live one at best, under a minimal amount of restrictions, if possible under no license, because data is often not the subject of copyright. And if it is the case, it should be something like CC0, public domain waiver, and simply released with no rights attached. And suddenly we find out that today a leading project finds the situation a lot more complicated, that they still adhere to this ideal of open data. They still use an open share-alike license, a copyleft license, where it's applicable, because a lot of the Wikimedia data is simply content which is copyrightable, but they add this element where they ask questions about sustainability, or what even some would call a business model. A pretty interesting case of how open data thinking is transforming. And one more example I want to give is an example we're looking closely at Open Future, and it's a case we call AI Commons. It's a story recognized around 4 years ago by the media, but running a long way back, about how openly licensed photographs of faces found on Flickr, on Wikimedia Commons, also in the shape of videos on YouTube, all under free licenses, have been used for AI and machine learning training. Some of you might know these AI training datasets such as Megaface or Coco, which it's a really interesting story. These are basically openly licensed photo datasets, which became foundations for basically a huge industry, also a huge research endeavor into all aspects of machine learning. So what's the paradox? What's the challenge there? A lot of the advocates of openness, also privacy advocates, look at this case as one, again, of some form of improportional imbalance of power, also of breaking a certain social norm around sharing. And there are several aspects to this case. One argument goes that these uses could not have been predicted when the photographs were shared, that this is a use that is not necessarily socially just, and that no consent was given if you approach this from a privacy perspective. Interestingly enough, from a copyright perspective, the case is relatively clear. Simply, these are openly licensed content, though interestingly enough, it seems that the licenses have actually been violated in some cases, for instance, the non-commercial condition. But maybe enforcement of licenses is a pretty traditional story. This is more interesting as a question of governance, again, for the open movement, for open data movement, certainly for Creative Commons and the community around this set of licenses, because the question is, so when you face these new challenges that couldn't be imagined 20 years ago, do we need to change something in our basic model, which today sometimes feels a bit naive, though which still holds a great promise. It's a model that says when you share, great things happen to content. So I would like to now shift to a European strategy on data, being mindful of these challenges to openness, but also want to show a policy context um, in which the open movement proponents of approaches like open source and open data should be functioning, because, as I said at the beginning, I think the policy environment, at least in Europe, is very relevant for our movement. It should not only be seen as defining some kind of guardrails for what's allowed, but rather for building important aspects of an ecosystem that we all want to create. So, what basically is the question around European data governance model? This model has been expressed in the European strategy on data published last year, and based on which we are now seeing a series of legislative developments, most importantly the Data Governance Act resolution and the Data Act currently, which soon hopefully will be presented as a proposal of the Act. And several other developments, not necessarily legislative ones. I think the question is, on some people believe that European data governance model as it is being developed, it should largely be seen as a barrier to innovation, barrier to economic growth. There's a very strong narrative around that. For example, a recent study on a different important piece of legislation, the AI Act, simply tried to measure the cost that, according to this research study created by a market think tank, the cost that the industry will simply, the European industry will pay in compliance. By the way, the numbers have been already now been questioned by researchers as too high and sort of unnecessarily scaremongering. But the other perspective, one I believe more, is sometimes uses the concept of Brussels effect and says that there is a European way of digital governance, very different from the sort of axiomatic two other approaches, the American and the Chinese one. And the European one, Europe itself calls it open strategic autonomy, believes that we can combine economic growth and digital growth with basically respect for human rights and societal values. And I would like to look at the data governance model in this perspective. I really like the data strategy. I think it's, again, a very interesting document that is no longer based on simple assumptions such as sharing more data will create a better world. And I think we need to admit that this was basically the simple insight at the heart originally, for instance, of open data movement, which, by the way, is still growing today. Here's the narrative when you start to think about more complex data governance. And this is the narrative presented by European policymakers. Big tech, by the way, in most cases not European companies, holds large part of world's data today, but not all data is yet captured by these entities. Winners of today will not necessarily be winners of tomorrow. There are spaces where Europe feels strong. Industrial data is mentioned, IoT in everyday life, and public interest use of data. The last one, I think, is very important for proponents of open data, and for sure from my perspective. Basically, the argument is that there are spaces where Europe can still win. And the most important idea for making this happen is the idea of so-called European data spaces. Multiple such spaces are envisioned covering key spheres of life, such as health, culture, education, or different aspects of the industry. And these data spaces, it's an idea that you can create an ecosystem where, in order to participate in it, you need to allow yourself to be governed or even regulated. In some areas it might happen through law, but there's also very interesting thinking, for example, in a recent paper by Professor Andrea Arenda, that a lot of this should be done by design, or to call it differently, by code. And we can see the Data Governance Act and the Data Act as ways of implementing this general idea that Europe can create a data governance model that doesn't just simply allow the market to shape the use of data. And I think the really interesting question from the perspective of open data is whether this is a continuation of the open data model, some kind of evolution, or a revolution. And the interesting answer, I think, is both. So the more important act to discuss currently is the Data Governance Act, because we still don't have a proposal for the Data Act, just the initial concept. We know directions the document will take, but not the details. In the Data Governance Act, there are specific provisions that basically concern open data and can be seen as further development of the Open Data Act or its extension. But these are relatively limited and concern defining conditions for reuse of protected public sector data. It can be protected for multiple reasons, and these are very varied. So this is both personal data, data which is intellectual property, and data held by cultural and educational establishments, because it is not in the scope of the Open Data Act. But the new act doesn't really say whether this data should be made open. It only defines conditions for possibly sharing such data due to the fact that it's seen as protected or sensitive data. The biggest debate is, of course, on personal data, and this is a really interesting aspect of the data governance debate, into which probably the open data movement needs to bring its perspective and define one. Because traditionally, of course, the answer was simple: if personal data doesn't fall under the scope of the open data approach, we're mainly dealing with non-personal data held by public institutions. But the question what to do with personal data cannot any longer be avoided. Why? Because the data governance model is a complex one, where both personal and non-personal data needs to be taken into account, often because simply they do get mixed up in complex data sets. So while the parts of the Data Act that concern open data are relatively narrow, the other elements are just as important. So next important concept is that of data altruism. It is a framework and a certification mechanism for voluntary data sharing. It's quite telling and interesting that this is simply not called open data. And again, this might be due to an attempt to cover also types of data that traditionally are not seen as open data. And the DGA introduces some unclarity, unnecessary complexity by not really very clearly delimiting what kind of data we are dealing with. Obviously, if the idea is to voluntarily share personal data, this is some new approach that requires to be carefully considered. If we are talking, and this is possible if you read the document, that data altruism simply is a way of redefining and certifying open data, then there are big risks that really this will be an unnecessary barrier. And it is unclear why, in the face of quite strong voluntary sharing of open data, this approach is needed. The third interesting part is around what now is called data intermediaries. This is a concept that you can have actors, usually commercial ones, but possibly also civic or public, who will basically intermediate the sharing of data by individuals, but also possibly by other entities. So it creates this model, championed, for example, by a great European initiative from Finland called My Data, which I assume some of you know, to again talk about not simple open data sharing, but more complex models. And in particular, what I think is really interesting is that the European Commission mentioned in the proposal data cooperatives. This idea hasn't been very well developed in the proposal, but it's worth noting that this model of data governance made it into a policy proposal. So this is the Data Governance Act. Maybe two also elements of the Data Act here are worth mentioning. So first of all, this act will concern business to government data sharing. This is the big topic, for example, around the sharing economy, where there is a strong appetite but also need for this data to be shared in the public interest. So the canonical case is transport apps and ride-sharing apps. where city governments are saying that this data is really relevant and should be shared with these public institutions to enable oversight of these companies, but also to provide valuable data for managing, for instance, urban transport in this case. So it'll be very interesting to see how this proposal looks. Our biggest concern as Open Futures that this should really be public interest, business to government data sharing. And another important part from the perspective of open data, as this is a debate that has been going on for a long time, is that the Act promises a review of the database directive. Without going into details, our position with a range of other organizations is that this Act should be repealed. It's not an easy process, but it is doable because the sui generis database right is simply an unnecessary barrier to data sharing and use. So I would like to now wrap up by saying that, coming back to my original idea, that we should be looking at these documents from a broader perspective and asking ourselves, if we support open data, for example, what is the broader policy perspective behind that? The big idea of digital single market is slowly weakening, and European policymakers are open to approaches that don't just mention market growth. This is sometimes described as a digital constitutionalist turn, constitutionalism which secures basically human rights, started in 2016 with the GDPR, 2018, 3 years ago. But we need more. At Open Future, we believe this is not enough to secure rights, but we need to have a positive vision, and we think this is a vision of a public space or a digital commons. This is ultimately what the policies should support. Several years ago, we created a policy vision called the Vision for a Shared Digital Europe with our partner, the Commons Network Foundation. And it's a vision that defines 4 principles. One of them is probably very clear to open data or open source advocates. It's about cultivating the commons. But we believe that today a more complex vision also needs to pay attention to decentralizing infrastructure, empowering public institutions, and enabling self-determination. I assume that for a lot of you, these ideas are close to your heart. And at the same time, I want to note that these are some of the issues that really haven't been discussed at the turn of the century when, for instance, the open content and open data models were developed. So, and ultimately, in light of these principles, I think the big paradox of data governance is one that I would frame as a question of balance or challenge between what we could call open access commons and strong commons. This is a terminology proposed by Professor Bodo Balas, a sociologist at the University of Amsterdam, and it's a distinction that I like a lot. Open access commons is sort of the well-known by now simple open approach, one espoused, for example, by the open data perspective, where by the way, it's not an approach that should be questioned. We at Open Future still very much believe in this approach, but we need to ask questions: at what point, where are the limits of this model, and whether at some point we should start thinking about an approach that could be called a strong commons approach of more complex governance in the case of data. This I try to illustrate with the AI Commons example, where we can see that this basic approach defined 20 years ago simply for a lot of people seems to break, and they are asking for something more. So this is, I think, the big debate that we will be facing around data in the coming years. As Open Future, we want to participate in this debate both by conducting conversation among advocates of open, which I hope you are listening to this talk, but also in the European policy space. Finishing this talk, I would like to thank you for listening to our ideas, and we really encourage you to get in touch, especially if you want to discuss how we can solve the paradox of open. Thank you very much.